Welcome to the studio. You're listening to Willow Waves, a student-produced podcast where kindergarten through 6th graders explore interests, promote solutions to global concerns, and communicate about everything related to our social and emotional learning.
We aim to amplify voices, share knowledge, and encourage conversations. Visit us at willowspringses.fcps.edu to learn more and subscribe.
Join us as we explore our diverse and dynamic world of elementary education.
Imagine you're on the ocean floor. You see 6,000 rock-like colorful creatures. Those are coral reefs.
But then you spot a piece of a coral reef drifting off into the ocean. It's barely visible now. Then a tourist comes and touches another coral reef.
Now a big chunk of that coral just ripped off and is now floating into the ocean. You are coming back to reality at this point. Even though you just imagined it, it's a real-life problem.
What you see there is coral bleaching. It is a problem that some people don't know about.
And that is our topic for today's episode.
Welcome to Willow Waves. My name is Avery Lee.
My name's Sahana.
And my name's Tavni Kamath.
A reminder that today's episode is about coral reefs.
Did you know that 25% of marine species need coral reefs to live and survive?
With the coral reefs going away, the marine animals are dying and some migrate to other locations where it's just not right for them.
For example, sea turtles, jellyfish, shrimp, and many more. Coral reefs are growing very slowly, which is why they're disappearing even faster.
Humans are causing the disappearance of coral reefs by polluting the oceans and overfishing. Tourists are adding to the problem by standing and touching the corals, which damages them.
If we don't act now, we may lose coral reefs by the end of the century.
Now joining us is Liv Williamson. She's a biologist and has a PhD at the University of Miami. Today she's going to be talking to us about coral reefs.
Hello, Dr. Williamson. Thank you for coming to our podcast. Today we have invited you here to tell us more about coral reefs. Let's get started. What inspired you to become a marine biologist?
Sure. I grew up by the ocean on the coast of Massachusetts. So from the time I was a little girl, I was running around on the beach all the time, playing with all the kind of animals that I could find in tide pools. I used to make sand castles and, put the little crabs on them, which they probably didn't like. Now in hindsight, I can recognize that, but I've always had a fascination with animals. I've always been a fan of being in the ocean and in the water. But I really didn't determine that I wanted to be a marine biologist until much later, until college. I think I had a general interest in science and biology and being outside and being in nature before that, but I didn't see it as a viable career path until I went to college and met people who were real marine biologists who inspired me to follow that path. None of my family are scientists, so I didn't really know that was an option growing up, but once I met some folks who inspired me with their work, I determined that I wanted to go down that path as well.
Can you tell us more about the disappearance of coral reefs?
Sure. So coral reefs are vitally important ecosystems. They are sort of referred to as the rainforests of the sea because they're home to over a quarter of all marine life in the ocean. Even though they only cover about 1% of the ocean floor, they're home to a ridiculous amount of different species, including a lot of species that we as humans rely on for food, for our fisheries, for industry, things like, mackerel that we eat, snapper, conch, lobster, all kinds of species that we think are important, for sustaining our own protein intake and fishery industries. And so they're super, super biodiverse, which makes them beautiful and amazing and important economically for us humans. But unfortunately, these ecosystems are also some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet because of how sensitive they are to environmental change. So corals have evolved over millions and millions of years to kind of survive in this very specific set of conditions that include kind of a narrow range of temperatures. They are only found in the tropics, so they kind of like warmish waters, but waters that don't change that much in temperature because there's not that much as far as seasons in the tropics. But global climate change is causing these more frequent and intense marine heat waves that actually push the temperatures around the corals to a temperature that's much too high for them to exist at. This is leading to a process called coral bleaching, where corals actually lose their symbiotic algae, so these tiny little algae that live in their tissues and photosynthesize, help to give those corals their energy, they can't do that anymore when these corals are experiencing really high temperatures. And so these corals bleach, they turn white. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see my little Zoom screen behind me, corals are supposed to be colorful. These ones are orange. So a white coral is not what you want. And actually those corals can starve and die if they don't get those algae back, if those temperatures don't go back down. So unfortunately, coral reefs all over the world are under threat because of global climate change. Even coral reefs that are way out in the Pacific that are super far away from any other human influence are still going to be influenced by global climate change, by marine heat waves. Nowhere is really safe from those impacts. And so unfortunately, in the last few decades, we've lost over half of the world's corals and coral reefs, including over half of those on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is the biggest coral reef in the world. And here in Florida, where I'm based in Miami, we actually have the world's third largest coral reef, which a lot of people in the United States don't realize. The United States, are home to a really big, amazing coral reef that we want to protect. And unfortunately, our system has lost even more than the Great Barrier Reef. The estimate is somewhere in the sort of 80% range of all of our corals have been lost in the last few decades. But fortunately, lots of folks are working on trying to protect them and bring them back as well.
I love how you said corals are the rainforest of the sea.
Very true.
They really are. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to go and snorkel or dive on one or even seen videos of them, but I mean, it's just teeming with life. There's fish and lobsters and invertebrates and all kinds of things. They're so colorful and amazing. It kind of reminds me of when you see a photo or a shot of the rainforest, and there's all these amazing animals and bugs and snakes and things everywhere. They're really amazing ecosystems.
What kind of solutions are you working on to help them live longer?
So because corals are under threat primarily from ocean warming, one of our main ways to try to combat their decline is by making the corals more heat tolerant, more able to deal with these marine heat waves when they come through. So we want to make the corals less likely to bleach, to lose their symbiotic algae, to turn white, and to starve and die. And there's a few different ways you can do that myself and my lab group and many other scientists around the world are working on. One of those ways is to target the algae themselves, so those symbiotic algae that live in the coral tissue and help them survive and grow. Those are really what's very heat sensitive and what the corals lose in a marine heat wave. And so if you're able to inoculate a coral or give a coral a different type, a more heat tolerant type of symbiotic algae, that coral will actually survive at higher temperatures and resist bleaching in the future. So there's various types that exist on reefs that are actually naturally present there of algae that are heat tolerant, but that don't commonly associate with the corals unless they've already bleached. And so we've been able to kind of collect that type of algae, harness that type of algae, grow it in a lab setting. So we're actually culturing this heat tolerant algae and then intentionally give it to corals, both adult corals that we bring into the lab and new baby corals that we breed in the lab, so that they're all sort of starting out with this more heat tolerant type of algae before we put them out onto the reef, in hopes that they will survive when the next heat wave comes through. And we do find that more heat tolerant type of symbiotic algae kind of buys these corals about 2 degrees Celsius extra in heat tolerance, which is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually a lot in the ocean. The ocean temperature doesn't fluctuate that much, and we see corals bleach when they're hit with just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius of an increase. That's sort of what I mean by a marine heat wave. It's not something crazy like 10 or 20 degrees. It's really on these margins where it still matters. And so by giving both adult and baby corals more heat tolerant types of algae, we're able to buy them some sort of more heat tolerance. It's not perfect, it doesn't mean that they're going to survive some super crazy marine heat wave that would be 4 degrees Celsius higher, but we hope we won't see something like that. Anyway, for the most part, those sorts of temperature fluctuations don't really happen in the ocean, and these heat waves that we see are more like a 1 to 2 degrees Celsius increase. Another avenue you can go, instead of by targeting the algae themselves, is by targeting the corals. So the coral's an animal. It's actually related to jellyfish and anemones. If you zoom in on a coral, you see that they're made up of these little polyps, we call them. It's sort of a mouth with tentacles in the middle. And so that animal has its own traits that can, and different individuals of that animal have different levels of those traits, kind of like all different humans. I might be more resistant to a certain disease than somebody else, or you might be able to, you might not get sunburned as easily as somebody else or something like that. There's a lot of genetic diversity within animal populations, human populations, and coral populations. And so we've identified individual corals that are actually more heat tolerant based on their genetics. So the makeup of their DNA gives them certain traits that make them more heat tolerant, make them less likely to bleach and die when they're hit with a marine heat wave. And we're targeting those corals for coral reef restoration efforts. So we're propagating them, we're sort of gardening them and making more and more of those corals as adults and planting them onto the reef. And we're also using them as parents and trying to breed those corals together that we think are more heat tolerant so that we can make more baby corals that are more heat tolerant. And that's also working really well.
That's actually really interesting. So does heat tolerance help let them live longer? Like if they have a very high heat tolerance, does that make them live longer?
Absolutely, yeah, especially in the face of climate change. The air temperature is getting warmer, so is the temperature in the ocean. And by being more heat tolerant, either by having a more heat tolerant type of symbiotic algae or by having more genes in your DNA and your genetic makeup that make you more heat tolerant, you as a coral are likely to survive a lot longer, unfortunately, under today's conditions than those that have not been sort of selectively bred or otherwise manipulated to have these more heat tolerant algae.
What is the hardest challenge you faced during your research?
I think one of the hardest parts about being an environmental scientist who is trying to think about solutions to, help keep our ecosystems healthy and protect them, is that there are a lot of forces kind of bigger than you and outside of your control that make that a little bit challenging. So for me, some days it's hard to stay optimistic because ultimately these solutions that we're finding for coral reefs, they're working really well, but they won't work forever if carbon emissions continue to increase. If we don't, as a global community, figure out a way to draw down the fossil fuels in our atmosphere and stop this, runaway global warming, ocean and air warming. Our solutions won't protect corals for hundreds of more years if we keep making our planet warmer and uninhabitable. So I think one of the things I have to do is just stay optimistic by being really happy about the work that I'm doing, the impact that myself and my colleagues are able to make, in our own little way, by sharing our work so that hopefully other people get involved, and just by saying, at least I'm trying, and I feel good that I'm trying to make a difference, even if, larger forces maybe make that hard sometimes.
I really love how do you transition the coral reefs from the lab into the ocean?
That's a great question. So yeah, the conditions that we have corals in a lab are of course very, very different from the ocean. We cannot replicate in a lab all of the different animals, all of the different microbial environments, all of the different abiotic factors, light and flow and all kinds of things like that. So we actually tend to do a transition for most corals when we bring them into the ocean from the lab. We actually put them in these sort of, we call them coral nurseries. So in the ocean, we have set up basically these built structures made out of pipes. So they're coral trees, we call them, or coral tables, where we're able to put the corals out into the ocean, but in a more protected environment where there aren't lots and lots of fish that might try to eat them or algae that might try to grow over them. It's kind of a transition environment for them, a nursery, where they're able to slowly acclimate to those ocean conditions. And then in a few months or weeks even, depending on what the coral is, we will then plant that coral to the reef where it has sort of primed itself to be in those ocean conditions now and maybe has better resources with which to be strong in the face of algae or fish that might try to prey on them or things like that. So we try to do it in stages, bringing corals from the lab to the ocean because those conditions are really different. We don't want to just throw them into their reef environment where there's so much going on. We want to bring them in stages.
a very difficult process, but very cool also.
Yes, this requires lots of time, scuba diving, to check on them in the nursery and then to also put them to the reef. So lots of scuba diving involved.
As warming waters devastate coral around the world, the Red Sea's reef have been remarkably resilient. Do you think Coral Reef in the Red Sea can teach us anything about how to help coral reefs in other parts of the world?
The Red Sea seems to be an amazing place, and I really hope to go there one day. I think part of what makes the Red Sea a really resilient place so far is that at least a portion of the Red Sea already has very warm waters, so some of the corals there are already sort of acclimated to warming conditions, and that likely means that they both have types of symbiotic algae that are more heat tolerant, and probably a lot of genes that are more heat tolerant in their, the coral animal tissue themselves. So I definitely think we have resources that we can try to harness there. For instance, we can try to learn about what those symbiotic algae are doing, what it is about them that are extra heat tolerant, and either introduce those algae to other places or try to take some of that information and use the algae that already exist in other places to try to breed is the wrong word, but kind of push those populations toward, say, having those genes that are more heat tolerant. And then similarly, we would be able to maybe breed some of those colonies that live in the Red Sea and that are extra heat tolerant with colonies from elsewhere. For instance, a lot of the species that exist in the Red Sea, the coral species and algae species, are found throughout the Pacific, so would be found on the Great Barrier Reef, for instance. Sort of the Indo-Pacific region, we call it, all have a lot of the same species in that basin. So potentially we could use some of the genetic material, either from the algae or from the corals in the Red Sea, to bring to other places throughout the Pacific that maybe need that heat tolerance, that have populations that are a little more sensitive.
Have you or your team gone there yet to research?
Unfortunately, no, I have not. I was actually supposed to in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. I was about 3 weeks away from traveling to Saudi Arabia to do work in the Red Sea. And then I was unable to do that, of course. So hopefully one day.
Seventh, if you had to choose, what would be your favorite coral reef and why?
That's very cool.
Seventh, if you had to choose one coral reef, what would be your favorite coral reef and why?
Oh, that's a great question and a difficult question. I have not had the chance to see a lot of the world's reefs in places like Australia and Indonesia, or the Red Sea, where I suspect they are absolutely spectacular, and certainly are from what I've seen. But from my own experience, which is primarily confined to the Caribbean, I was lucky enough to do some research in the Bahamas. And when I went in 2018 and 2019, a lot of the reefs in the Bahamas were just absolutely beautiful. I think in comparison to, Florida, which is a very, very populated place, there's a lot of pressure on our coral reefs here from, land-based sources of pollution and tons of boaters and overfishing. Our coral reefs are under a lot of pressure here in Florida. The Bahamas is very sparsely populated. It's further out sort of toward the main open ocean, so they have kind of a lot more, kind of nicer conditions, if you will. And those reefs are just really healthy and beautiful, or at least they were in 2018 and 2019 when I was there. So just really, really big, beautiful brain corals that are kind of like the size of a car. And these thickets of this coral species that you see in my background behind me, the staghorn corals, just like trees, covering the seafloor, and so many big fish and sharks swimming around in them, which we just don't see as much here in Florida because all of those things have been fished out. So I would say specifically somewhere in the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas would be my favorite reef that I've ever been on.
So lastly, what is one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
Oh, that's a great question. Even if you're not an environmental scientist yet, you can still advocate for the ocean or any other ecosystem that you feel compelled to advocate for, that you want to help protect. To me, the best thing you can do, especially as kids, is to tell your friends and your family about why we should care about these ecosystems. If you're not able to vote yet, tell people who can why these ecosystems matter, and try to influence them to maybe think about why they should vote for folks who care about our environment. That's a really important power that you have, even as someone who's not 18 yet. So I encourage you to do that. And, think about the ways that you can just minimize your own environmental impact, of course, through potentially eating less meat, or recycling, or using reef-safe sunscreen when you're in the reef. But to me, even your individual choices aren't as important as our collective, societal choices. That's what's really going to address climate change. So advocate. Be an activist. Tell your friends and family when you are 18, vote for folks who are prioritizing these issues. These are ecosystems that you're going to inherit. I'm not that old either, that I want to still be able to enjoy for the rest of my life. And you can do that even if you're not a scientist.
Those words are very inspiring.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Soren. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled that you're all interested in this topic, and so happy that you're helping to raise awareness among your peers about the importance and plight of coral reefs. So thank you for your interest.
Follow Dr. Williamson and her team at Coral Reef Futures on their Instagram. Well, thank you for listening to HCR. Remember, we can only solve this problem if everyone works together. We'll see you soon!
HCR was produced by Sahana Sudhir, Avery Lee, and Tavni Kamat.
Help from Miss Logan Williams.
Special thanks to Liv Williamson for coming on the show.